The flight attendant duct-taped the black CEO to his seat for looking dangerous while he was shouting and crying for help. Then he cut himself loose with his Rolex. What happens next will leave you speechless. He was trapped, humiliated, but not broken. Subscribe if you stand for strength, resilience, and fighting back against hate. He looks dangerous? The words cut through the quiet cabin like a sudden gust of cold wind. They weren't meant for the passengers to hear, but the whisper had bled through the crew's comm line, crackling faintly into the air just loud enough for those nearby to catch. Kenton Durrell froze mid-motion, his fingers still hovering above his phone's screen. For a moment, he thought he'd misheard. But as he slowly turned his head, locking eyes with the pale flight attendant standing a few feet away, any illusion of misunderstanding vanished. Darryl Knox didn't flinch. His narrow face remained locked in an unreadable expression, save for the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth, a smirk, maybe, or just an involuntary movement of disdain. Kenton had seen that look before. It was the kind that didn't scream hatred, it whispered it, quiet, deliberate, and coded behind protocol and false politeness. The soft hum of the aircraft filled the space between them. First class was quiet, peaceful even. Leather seats, blue LED floor lights, and the distant rattle of drinkware being arranged in the galley added a false sense of normalcy. But beneath it all, something was shifting. Kenton slowly placed his phone down on the tray table in front of him, keeping his hands visible and his posture calm. He could feel the pressure building in the cabin, like oxygen being slowly drained from the room. A man in seat 2C, seated diagonally behind him, turned slightly and glanced at him with furrowed brows, sensing the tension but not saying a word. Kenton knew the rules of moments like this. He had spent his life mastering them. How to hold himself just firm enough not to seem passive, but never firm enough to be labeled aggressive. How to smile without seeming smug, to speak without inviting suspicion. He had risen through boardrooms and battlegrounds of perception to become CEO of Xerovia Dynamics. But in this space, 30,000 feet in the air, surrounded by strangers and flight staff with unchecked authority, none of that seemed to matter. He cleared his throat gently. "Excuse me," he said, directing his voice to Darryl with the cool civility he had practiced countless times. "Is there a problem?" Darryl tilted his head slightly, a false look of surprise forming on his face. "No, sir. Just standard protocol. Enjoy your flight." His voice was low and flat, his eyes still fixed on Kenton's like he was waiting for a misstep. The answer wasn't meant to clarify, it was meant to dismiss. Kenton nodded once and leaned back in his seat, trying to focus again on the notes glowing on his laptop screen. His keynote address was scheduled for the next morning in Belcroft City, a major tech summit where he would be opening with a speech on the ethics of artificial intelligence surveillance and algorithmic bias. It was a topic some had found uncomfortable. A few government-linked vendors had quietly tried to get him removed from the speaker lineup, but Kenton had refused to back down. Still, that shouldn't have followed him here, not to this flight, not to this seat. Yet something about Darryl's voice, his movements, his silence, it felt personal. Darryl didn't move away. He stood by the edge of the galley, speaking softly into his mic again, lips barely moving. The only indication was the tiny red light flickering on his collar mic, signaling an open line. Kenton's fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the armrest. He wasn't imagining this. He wasn't being paranoid. The other male flight attendant, a taller man in his late 20s with buzzed hair and a cautious expression, peeked briefly out of the galley curtain, made eye contact with Darryl, then disappeared again without a word. Darryl glanced toward the cockpit and subtly adjusted something on the control panel near the jump seat. Kenton couldn't see what, but it looked like a camera angle, possibly internal surveillance being toggled. Why? His instincts, honed from years of boardroom warfare and private security briefings, were flaring like sirens now. He tried to steady his breathing. It could still be nothing. He'd experienced his share of uncomfortable glances and passive hostility during travel, especially in first class, where his presence often invited unspoken questions. But this wasn't the usual. He looked across the aisle and caught a reflection of himself in the cabin window, his slate-gray suit, crisp collar, watch glinting faintly under the overhead light. Impeccable. Unthreatening. Still, somehow, a problem. The Rolex on his wrist felt heavier than usual. It wasn't just a luxury item, it had been his grandfather's, passed down through generations. More than a timepiece, it was a symbol, a reminder of survival, of building something where the odds were stacked high, A faint buzz sounded as the flight attendants began moving carts down the aisle, but Kenton's section remained untouched. No welcome, no drink, not even the usual first-class smile. Darrell remained posted across from him, watching without blinking. Waiting, perhaps. Kenton opened his laptop again, eyes flicking over his opening lines. Progress means nothing if it forgets the people it claims to serve. He closed the screen slowly. He needed to be ready. A few rows back, someone coughed. Another passenger asked for a blanket. Normal sounds. But for Kenton, the silence around his seat was louder than the hum of the engines. Every movement felt watched. Every action judged. He shifted slightly, and that was when Darrell's stance changed again, his shoulders tensing, one hand moving to the mic. Kenton wasn't a man prone to fear, but the realization hit him like cabin pressure snapping mid-flight. This was more than discomfort. This was suspicion, premeditated, maybe even coordinated. And if something went wrong up here, it wouldn't be his voice that got believed first. He took a breath and steadied himself. This flight wasn't going to be easy. He looked back at Darrell one more time and saw no change in his expression, only the same cold stare, as if he were watching something already condemned. Kenton leaned back, heart pounding against the inside of his chest, the seatbelt firm across his lap. He had a feeling the turbulence ahead wasn't going to come from the skies. Sometimes you can feel the storm long before it breaks. The sound tore through the dim cabin like a blade, sharp, sudden, unmistakable, the rip of duct tape. Kenton turned instinctively, water bottle still in hand, confusion crossing his face. Before he could utter a single word, two male crew members surged toward him from opposite aisles like shadows breaking formation. One clamped hard onto his left arm, twisting it with surprising strength, while the other gripped his right shoulder and forced him backward into his seat. "What are you doing?" Kenton shouted, his voice rising above the soft hum of the aircraft. "What is this? Let go of me." His words came fast, panicked, but controlled. The men didn't answer. Their faces were tight with determination, too focused, too deliberate. Darrell Knox approached, his expression disturbingly calm, almost satisfied. In his hands was a thick roll of industrial duct tape, the silver sheen catching the faint overhead light. "For everyone's safety," Darrell said coldly, tearing another length of tape and nodding to the crewman. "What are you talking about?" Kenton protested, struggling now as the tape wrapped around his chest, pinning him to the seat. "I asked for water. I haven't done anything." The tape hissed again as they wound it around his forearms, strapping them tightly against the armrests. It compressed his tailored suit, flattening the crisp fabric and pulling painfully against his wrists. His legs kicked, but one of the crewmen pressed them down with a knee, binding them swiftly to the base of the seat. "I'm the CEO of Serovia Dynamics," Kenton shouted, his voice raw with disbelief. "This is insane. Stop." But Darrell didn't stop. He took another strip and placed it firmly across Kenton's lap, securing the last point of restraint like he was sealing a parcel. Then he stood back, surveying his work with disturbing detachment. Passengers nearby had begun to stir. A few gasped audibly. One woman reached for her phone, trembling fingers fumbling with the camera icon. Across the aisle, a man sat frozen, mouth slightly open, eyes flicking between Kenton and the crew. But no one moved. No one intervened. "He was fidgeting too much," Darrell said flatly to the cabin, his voice louder now, rehearsed. "He's a threat." Kenton's mouth fell open. "What?" he breathed, stunned. "Is that what you're calling this?" The duct tape bit into his skin as he fought against it. Sweat began to collect at his temple, his heart pounding not just from fear, but fury. "I didn't threaten anyone," Kenton roared, the strength of his voice cracking through the quiet cabin. "I didn't raise my voice, didn't touch anyone. You taped me for asking for water?" Darrell didn't answer. He turned away, speaking softly into his shoulder mic. The cockpit door remained shut. No announcement, no explanation. The pilot was silent. Kenton looked around, scanning faces. Some passengers pretended not to see. A few stared, stunned into paralysis. One teenager clutched his phone but didn't record. His hand was shaking too much. "Somebody help me," Kenton cried out again. "This is unlawful. This is abuse." Still, no one moved. The silence in the cabin deepened, becoming something heavier than fear. It was complicity. A few rows behind, a young boy leaned toward his father and whispered, "Why didn't they do that to the man yelling earlier?" The father lowered his eyes, lips pressed tightly together. He didn't answer. He couldn't. Even cages are easier to build when no one speaks. The sound of Kenton's breath was sharp and uneven, echoing in his ears louder than the quiet hum of the plane. He strained against the restraints, the thick duct tape biting into his wrists, burning the skin red. His shoulders ached from the awkward angle they'd forced him into, and his face glistened with sweat, not from heat, but from disbelief, humiliation, and fury. His heart pounded against his ribcage like it was trying to escape. Each second he remained bound felt like another blow to his dignity. Across the aisle, a younger flight attendant stood stiffly by the beverage cart. His name tag read Reeve. He hadn't participated in the assault, but Kenton had seen the way he looked when the tape first unraveled from the roll. Reeve's eyes had darted to the floor, then to the passengers, then back to Darrell, the lead flight attendant whose face had never once softened. Now, Reeve's gaze flicked to Kenton again. This time, their eyes met. For a breathless second, neither moved. In that moment, Kenton saw it. Guilt. Not just hesitation, but the first signs of conscience. The young man swallowed hard and shifted uncomfortably, fidgeting with a plastic cup he wasn't even serving. Then, turning slightly, Reeve brought a hand to his mic and muttered under his breath. "This feels wrong, Darrell." His voice was soft, hesitant, the kind of voice that had never been trained to challenge. From the galley, Darrell's response shot back instantly, sharp and cold. "Orders stand." That word, orders, cut deeper than the tape. Kenton blinked slowly, his mind latching onto the phrase. Orders? From whom? He had assumed Darrell acted out of arrogance, maybe racism, maybe misplaced authority. But orders? That suggested something more calculated, more structured. This hadn't been a panicked response to an unruly passenger. It had been methodical, precise, too precise. The two men who pinned him down had moved like they were trained for it, one bracing his shoulder, the other wrapping his arms in tight, practiced loops of tape. No fumbling, no shouting between them, only quiet, mechanical efficiency. That wasn't normal. Kenton closed his eyes and thought back. Just before boarding, a middle-aged man in an ardent air blazer had greeted him at the priority gate. The man had been polite, but cold. He'd asked questions that didn't quite make sense. "What's the nature of your visit to Belcroft? Are you traveling alone? Any sensitive materials in your laptop?" At the time, Kenton had chalked it up to routine questioning. Being a high-profile black executive came with its share of unusual moments. But now, sitting restrained with his muscles cramping, it clicked. His keynote speech in Belcroft wasn't just another tech presentation. He was scheduled to speak about ethical boundaries in artificial intelligence, specifically calling out federal programs that used flawed AI for surveillance and profiling. Garovia's latest research had challenged the very systems that companies like Ardent quietly profited from through defense contracts. Could this entire situation be more than just personal bias? Could it be a warning? Kenton's fingers twitched involuntarily under the tape. The weight of his Rolex against his wrist grounded him. He looked down, and the gleam of the polished silver caught the overhead light. It wasn't just a timepiece. His grandfather's Rolex was custom-modified, a gift from the Carovia board when Kenton closed his first billion-dollar deal. He remembered the hidden clasp. A micro-tool set inside. Not much, just a miniature blade meant to slice zip ties in emergencies. Most executives never used it, but Kenton remembered the specs. They had taped his hands, but not well enough to cover the watch completely. His pulse steadied slightly as a new plan formed. Slowly, he shifted his left wrist, letting the Rolex brush against the metal armrest. A faint ting echoed as the casing bumped against it. No one noticed. Not yet. He lowered his eyes, calming his breath. Across the aisle, Reeves stole another glance. His posture was tense. His hands weren't moving. He wasn't pouring drinks. He wasn't pretending anymore. He was waiting, watching, wrestling with himself. Kenton gave him a look, calm, deliberate, steady. He didn't plead, he didn't mouth words, but his eyes said everything. "I'm not done, and you know this is wrong." Reeve looked away, but this time he didn't speak into the mic. He didn't step toward Darrell. He simply stayed still. That was enough. Kenton tilted the watch downward, feeling for the small groove near the edge. It took effort. His wrists were stiff, the tape rough, but he found it. A click, then a flick. The blade popped free, barely visible beneath his cuff. He shifted the tiny blade toward the inner seam of the tape across his lap, working slowly, rhythmically, inch by inch. A bead of sweat rolled down his temple, but he ignored it. His breathing slowed, controlled, focused. The cabin was dim. Most passengers had their shades drawn. Some still whispered, glancing at him occasionally, but no one interfered. The same silence that allowed Daryl's assault now gave Kenton space to escape. His hand moved gently beneath the blanket a nervous man had tossed over his knees earlier. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was shame. Either way, it shielded his movement. The tape across his left wrist loosened first. The plastic fibers frayed as the blade sliced through the tension. He flexed gently, then kept going. His right hand took longer, but he worked with the patience of someone who had spent his entire life learning how to move quietly in rooms that feared him. Across the aisle, Reeve finally looked again. Kenton leaned slightly, the tape over his midsection loosening. His arms were no longer completely restrained. Just one more seam to cut. Their eyes met again. This time, Kenton's voice was a whisper, almost carried by the hum of the engines. "Help me, or step aside." Reeve didn't flinch. He didn't nod either. He just stood there, paralyzed by a choice he had avoided too long. But he didn't move to stop him. He didn't report it. He didn't side with Daryl. Kenton accepted that. Sometimes silence is the only rebellion people know how to offer. The final strap gave way, but he didn't move yet. He didn't leap. He didn't shout. Instead, Kenton straightened his back, tucked the broken tape under the blanket, and calmly rested his hands on his thighs, the Rolex still gleaming beneath the cabin lights. He closed his eyes briefly, letting his body breathe for the first time since the assault. In the faint reflection of the window beside him, he saw movement. Daryl was walking down the aisle again, medical tape in hand, smug and unaware. Kenton didn't tense. He simply waited, because he knew. They taped my hands, but they forgot what was on them. The blanket draped over Kenton's lap shifted as he moved. His wrists still stung from the tight binding, and the adhesive of the duct tape itched like fire against his skin. But he didn't flinch. He didn't blink. Every breath was measured, every movement small enough to escape the watchful eyes of the crew. The cabin lights had dimmed again, casting a bluish haze over first class. The quiet hum of the engines filled the air, interrupted only by the occasional cough or rustle of a magazine. No one looked his way. Not anymore. Most had already made their choice to look down, to stay out of it. Kenton's fingers moved under the blanket with slow precision. He pressed the underside of his Rolex, the one his grandfather gave him, against the hard plastic edge of the armrest. It was a gamble. The watch had a concealed tool, a feature only a handful of Carovia Dynamics top executives knew about. It had never been tested like this, never meant for an emergency this absurd, but Kenton had memorized its specs, studied the inner workings for the sake of curiosity. Now, that knowledge might be his only way out. The edge of the clasp pressed firmly. He twisted gently, just enough to trigger the hidden catch. Click. A tiny, almost inaudible sound. His pulse quickened. The microblade emerged, barely an inch long but gleaming with purpose. He adjusted his wrist carefully, avoiding any sudden movement. Slowly, he guided the blade toward the thick silver tape across his thighs. The first stroke was awkward, the angle tight. The blade snagged slightly. Kenton's jaw clenched. He shifted the edge again and sliced, gently, precisely. Fibers frayed. Tape peeled. The cut wasn't clean, but it was progress. He worked steadily, inch by inch, sweat gathering beneath his collar. Every muscle in his body ached to move faster, but he resisted. Patience, he reminded himself. He couldn't afford even one suspicious glance. Across the aisle, a quiet rustle. Kenton's eyes lifted just slightly, enough to catch movement in his periphery. Reeve, the younger attendant, the one who had hesitated during the incident, stood at the beverage cart. He was pretending to organize cups, but his eyes kept drifting. They locked with Kenton's. For a single moment, everything around them faded. "Help me, or step aside," Kenton whispered, his voice low, steady, deadly quiet. Reeve's face twitched. His fingers tightened around a stack of napkins. He said nothing. Did nothing. But he also didn't call the others. His silence hung like a fragile thread in the charged air. Kenton understood. That was all he would get. And for now, it was enough. The next strip of tape gave way, peeling upward in slow, crackling layers. Kenton's hands, red and raw, were finally loose. He kept them beneath the blanket, careful not to move too fast. His breathing slowed as he turned his attention to the restraints around his ankles. The process was slower, more awkward, but he didn't stop. The dull drone of the engines masked the soft, tearing sound. No one noticed, or pretended not to. One more pass with the blade, one more careful twist, and then freedom. The last strap fell away silently, sticking for a moment to the edge of his polished shoe before curling onto the floor. Kenton didn't leap to his feet. He didn't shout. He remained still, spine straight, eyes forward. His posture betrayed none of the storm brewing inside him. He was a man restrained not by tape anymore, but by control. And that control was his sharpest weapon. A faint shimmer in the window caught his eye. The reflection showed movement. Darryl, returning. The senior attendant walked with forced casualness, a roll of medical tape in hand, likely to reinforce the restraints or cover the bruises his own orders had caused. His smirk was faint, almost rehearsed. Kenton's fingers curled slightly under the blanket. His blade was folded away, watch back in place. He took one deep breath, then another. Reeve stepped aside from the cart, saying nothing, eyes flicking between Kenton and Darryl. Darryl drew closer, unaware of what waited in the stillness. The aisle was narrow. The silence was tight, and everything felt like it was about to break. Kenton closed his eyes briefly, not in fear, but in focus. The moment had arrived. His restraint had not been weakness, it was strategy. In the stillness, he found his advantage. In the reflection of the window, he saw Darryl's hand extend toward him. And then, just before contact, Kenton's eyes opened. Sometimes, the best revenge begins in silence. Darryl reached Kenton's row with a forced smile stretched too tightly across his face, one hand gripping a roll of medical tape like a bandage for control. His steps were quick and quiet, rehearsed as if he'd done this before, not with violence, but with the subtle force of authority misused under the mask of procedure. Kenton opened his eyes just as Darryl leaned in, his shadow cutting across Kenton's lap like a guillotine. The moment their eyes met, something shifted. Kenton's breath slowed. Time seemed to thicken around him. Then he moved. In one sharp motion, Kenton's right arm shot up and seized Darryl's wrist midair. The tape dropped with a thud to the floor, rolling gently down the aisle like a symbol of undone control. Kenton twisted Darryl's arm behind his back with surprising precision, the movement tight and practiced, not from violence, but from preparation, years of understanding that sometimes survival required more than silence. Darryl yelped, high and sharp, the sound slicing through the dimmed cabin. His face twisted in pain and disbelief as Kenton stood, rising tall from the shredded remains of the duct tape still clinging to his slate-gray suit. Gasps spread through the cabin like a gust of wind. A few passengers bolted upright in their seats. One man clapped instinctively before lowering his hands awkwardly, glancing around. Some reached for their phones again, no longer afraid to be seen recording. Others just watched, unsure if they were witnessing a crime or a correction. "He attacked me!" Darryl shouted, his voice cracking with a mix of desperation and defiance. He tried to twist away, but Kenton held firm, not out of vengeance, but necessity. A man 2 rows back stood, tall and tense. His voice was calm but firm as he spoke. "No." We saw it. He broke free. His eyes didn't leave Darryl, and his tone held weight, the kind that couldn't be ignored. Others began nodding, murmuring quietly. The tide had shifted. Reeve came running down the aisle, eyes wide, face pale. He stepped between them, raising a hand to Kenton and resting the other lightly on Darryl's chest to keep him back. "This went too far," Reeve said, his voice low but clear. There was a tremor of guilt in his words, as though he knew it had gone too far long before this moment. "You're finished," Darryl hissed through clenched teeth, glaring at Reeve like a cornered animal. Reeve didn't flinch. "I'd rather be finished than a coward." The cabin lights flickered slightly as the pilot's voice finally broke through the overhead speaker, cracking with static. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be making our descent into Belcroft shortly." But his voice sounded thin, distant, like an echo trying to catch up with reality. He clearly had no idea what had just happened in the cabin, or perhaps chose not to know. Kenton stood alone in the aisle, the silver strands of broken tape fluttering to the floor with each breath he took. His hands were scraped, wrists raw, suit wrinkled and frayed at the shoulders. But he stood straight, his presence steady and unshaken. The quiet hum of the engines could not drown out the truth now uncoiling in the cabin. He looked down at his wrist and slowly lifted the Rolex. It gleamed faintly in the low cabin light, scuffed, scratched, and slightly dented from the struggle. But it still ticked, still counted, still bore the weight of the past and the readiness of the present. He turned to face the passengers, some ashamed, some stunned, some brave enough to meet his gaze. This watch wasn't just for time. It was for moments like these. The landing gear groaned into position with a heavy thud beneath the cabin, and the plane dipped slightly as it prepared for descent. Kenton remained standing, one arm slightly bent from the tension in his shoulders, the other holding onto the headrest of the seat beside him for balance. The remnants of torn duct tape clung to the cuffs of his once pristine slate-gray suit, now wrinkled and flared awkwardly where the restraints had torn loose. His chest rose and fell steadily, but his eyes flickered with a sharp, alert fire. He was no longer just a passenger. He was now a symbol of something far greater, and everyone around him knew it. Darrell Knox, the pale, tight-lipped flight attendant who had initiated the entire assault, now sat slumped near the forward galley, his hands cuffed loosely in front of him with a zip tie Reeve had produced from an emergency kit. Darrell's face twitched with fury, lips pressed in a tight line as he scanned the cabin, searching for any sign of backup or sympathy. None came. Reeve stood just a few steps away, arms crossed, his back against the service door. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it was firm, like a man who had made a choice and was determined to see it through. Around them, the first-class cabin had transformed. The earlier hush of silent complicity was gone. Phones were held high, camera lenses aimed, screens glowing in the dimmed lights. The whispers that had begun when Kenton broke free had grown louder, shifting from curiosity to conviction. Passengers who had averted their eyes earlier now leaned forward, murmuring with each other, some even filming quietly from across the aisle. One man, perhaps in his late 30s with wire-rimmed glasses and a loosened tie, leaned toward the man beside him and whispered, "I thought he was dangerous. Turns out they were." Kenton heard it. He turned slowly, eyes sweeping over the rows behind him. The cabin tilted ever so slightly as the plane adjusted course, but he didn't waver. His voice came out low but clear, strong enough to carry without effort. "You all saw it. You all let it happen. And still, I'm the threat?" A dense silence fell. Not even the hum of the engines could mask its weight. Some passengers lowered their phones, their faces now filled with something deeper than shock, shame. Others looked away completely, unable to meet Kenton's gaze. The quiet felt heavier than the clouds outside. Reeve, standing beside Kenton now, leaned forward slightly and pressed a folded slip of paper into his palm. Kenton glanced down. A phone number, handwritten, not printed. No name, no explanation. He looked up with narrowed eyes. "What is this?" he asked, his voice quieter now, more private. Reeve's jaw tensed. He hesitated, then said just above a whisper, "Internal Affairs." "Call it. You weren't the first." Kenton froze, absorbing the words. "What do you mean?" he asked, his brow furrowing as he stared hard at Reeve's face. But Reeve didn't answer. Instead, his eyes drifted to Darrell, still seated in silence with clenched fists and a jaw tight enough to crack. Kenton followed the glance, and suddenly the pieces began to shift. He remembered the young black man with earbuds who'd been told twice to lower his voice, even though he wasn't speaking. The brown-skinned teenager across the aisle who had been asked to show his boarding pass 3 separate times. The middle-aged gentleman in a beige sport coat who had been offered water after everyone else, and who, like Kenton, had only received a tight-lipped glare when he tried to speak up. It wasn't random. Kenton turned back toward Reeve, who now stood with arms folded again, his eyes unreadable. "This wasn't just panic," Kenton said, more to himself than anyone. "This wasn't just fear." Reeve didn't nod, didn't confirm, but he didn't deny it either. Kenton's thoughts churned. The signs were there. From the moment he'd stepped onto the plane, the tension wasn't about his behavior. It was about his presence, his skin, his seat, his status. Every person Darrell had scolded or stared at with suspicion looked like him. Black, brown, young, silent, and always seated in the section not traditionally meant for them, first class. He looked back toward the passengers, some now fidgeting uncomfortably. He saw the boy with the earbuds look up, wide-eyed, his hands clenched on his lap. He saw a man 3 rows back mouth a silent, "I'm sorry," though he didn't say it aloud. Kenton exhaled slowly as the plane dipped slightly lower, the rooftops of Belcroft City beginning to dot the horizon. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The silence he left behind spoke for him. The cabin crew prepared for landing. A robotic voice came over the intercom announcing tray tables and seat backs. The normalcy of it felt surreal, layered over the tension still humming beneath the surface. Kenton tightened his grip around the slip of paper Reeve had given him. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with clarity. This was bigger than a single flight, bigger than tape, bigger than a bruised wrist or a slanderous whisper. It was about a pattern, a system, a quiet routine that lived in the shadows of comfort and habit. He looked once more at Darrell, who sat breathing shallowly, his defiance draining like air from a pressurized cabin. Kenton said nothing to him. There was nothing left to say. He turned toward the window as the plane descended through thick clouds, the sunlight flickering in and out. The cabin was quiet again, but this silence was different. It wasn't apathy anymore. It was awareness. This wasn't about fear. This was routine. The aircraft wheels screeched lightly against the tarmac as Flight 908 touched down, the sudden jolt stirring a ripple of unease through the cabin. Kenton Durrell remained standing near his seat, his posture straight despite the remnants of torn tape clinging to his slate-gray suit. Darrell Knox, now seated and restrained by the younger attendant Reeve, smirked with barely concealed malice, his voice low and venom-laced. "You think breaking out changed anything?" Darrell hissed, his lip curled in a sneer. "They're still going to believe me." Kenton didn't respond immediately. He met Darrell's glare, but behind the calm in his eyes was a fire held on a tight leash. His wrists ached from the earlier restraints, but his focus was unshaken. The jet taxied slowly toward the gate, and through the windows, several uniformed airport security officers stood stiffly by the jet bridge, waiting. The sight made Kenton tense. His mind braced for the worst. As the plane rolled to a stop, seatbelts clicked loose around the cabin. Passengers stood, some slowly, others hurriedly, stealing glances at Kenton and the restrained flight attendant. For the first time, a man in a charcoal vest near row 4 stepped forward, his voice rising above the hushed cabin. "We saw everything," the man said firmly. His face was pale but resolute, his eyes locked on Darrell. "We're not going to lie for you." Another man from the back added, "That wasn't security protocol?" That was abuse. Kenton's heart thudded at the sound of support, but he remained composed. The pilot emerged from the cockpit at last, clearly flustered, tugging awkwardly at the sleeves of his uniform. He scanned the cabin with wide eyes, as though trying to assess the aftermath without drawing blame. "You didn't check in once," Kenton said, stepping forward. His voice was steady, authoritative. "You let this happen. I want your name and your report before I leave this aircraft." The pilot opened his mouth to speak but faltered. He gave a curt nod and moved toward the cockpit phone, trying to salvage the image of control. As the main cabin door hissed open, bright light from the terminal spilled into the space, cutting through the heavy tension like a blade. 2 men stepped aboard in dark jackets and jeans, each flashing discreet but official-looking badges as they approached Kenton. One had a well-trimmed beard and spoke first. "Mr. Durrell," he said calmly, "Civil Aviation Authority. We received a call from someone mid-flight. Mind stepping with us for a few questions?" Kenton blinked, his muscles tensed again. "Did Ardent Air request this?" The second agent, taller and younger, shook his head. "No, sir. Someone from your company reached out after they lost contact with you during the flight. We're here on your behalf." Kenton stared at them, uncertain. He hadn't called anyone. No one had access to his phone. He had barely moved since being bound. He felt a flicker of confusion pass through his chest. His assistant wouldn't have panicked without reason. Then, in the corner of his mind, a detail returned, like a flickering candle finally catching flame. The boy, 2 rows behind. He must have been no older than 10. He'd glanced at Kenton several times during the altercation, eyes wide, body half-curled behind the seat as his father hushed him protectively. At the time, Kenton thought nothing of it, but now it all clicked. He turned slightly, scanning the rows, and caught the boy peeking out again, his gaze uncertain but steady. The father gently squeezed his shoulder as if to say, "You did the right thing." Kenton turned back to the officials. "Yes, I'll come with you." The walk down the aisle was slow, each step heavy with judgment from the events that had unfolded. Phones followed his movement, some still filming, others lowered in silent respect. As Kenton passed Reeve, the younger attendant stood upright, shoulders squared. "I'll talk to them too," Reeve said quietly. "This needs to be told." Darrell spat a curse under his breath and struggled against the seatbelt now restraining him. but no one moved to help him. Not anymore. The two officials flanked Kenton as they exited the aircraft. The terminal buzzed with activity, arrival boards blinking, distant announcements echoing overhead, but in their small corridor, everything felt quiet, like a threshold had been crossed. One of the agents turned to him again. "We'll get a formal statement soon, but for now, just know you weren't alone up there." Kenton nodded, his throat dry. The adrenaline had faded, but a new resolve was already forming. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was bigger than any one flight. As they passed through the gate area, a journalist's voice called out somewhere behind the ropes. "Mr. Durrell, is it true you were restrained mid-flight?" Another asked. "Do you plan to sue Ardent Air?" Kenton didn't stop. He didn't need to answer yet, because this wasn't the end. This was the moment everything began to shift. Sometimes, he thought to himself, as his eyes glanced one last time at the boy in the terminal windows above, the smallest witness turns the tide. They saw him as a threat, so they silenced him with duct tape. If you believe no one should be restrained for their skin color, hit subscribe now. This story demands justice. The fluorescent lights in the terminal were harsh, cold, clinical, and unflinching, like the eyes of those watching Kenton Durrell as he was quietly escorted through a side corridor by two security officials. His suit, still creased and torn from the duct tape, rustled faintly with each step. Blood had dried beneath the cuff where the edge of the Rolex had scraped his wrist raw. But Kenton walked tall, chin level, expression unreadable. Behind him, Darryl Knox was being led away in a separate direction, his hands cuffed, his voice low and bitter as he muttered to the officer at his side. Inside the secure room, Kenton was offered a chair and a bottle of water. The walls were bare, except for a single panel of reinforced glass that looked into the adjacent interview room. Through it, he could see Reeve already seated across from two investigators. The young flight attendant was pale, his hands clasped tightly on the table, voice low but firm. "I have the manifest," Reeve said, "and internal crew messages. There's also something else, from the galley." He pulled a small device from his coat pocket. One of the officers leaned forward. "Body cam?" Reeve nodded. "I started wearing one after last year's Vegas flight. There was a case where a kid got restrained for making a mess. I didn't want to get caught in another lie I didn't tell." Kenton listened, barely breathing, as Reeve placed the footage into their hands. Through the speaker in the viewing room, Kenton could hear every word. "They told me not to question Darryl," Reeve continued. "Said he had seniority. Said if I wanted to keep my job, I should stay quiet. So I did. For months. But this?" His voice cracked slightly. "This went too far." Kenton leaned back in his chair. The pressure behind his eyes was growing, but he forced himself to stay sharp. Outside the room, the muffled noise of the terminal began to shift. At first, it was just a murmur, then footsteps, then the unmistakable rhythm of rapid shutter clicks. It was starting. One of the civil aviation officers stepped in. "Mr. Durrell," he said, holding a tablet, "you should see this." The screen lit up with a paused video. Kenton recognized it instantly. It was from Seat 3C. Someone had recorded the moment the duct tape wrapped around his torso, the silver flash glaring under the cabin lights. The clip resumed. It showed him shouting, struggling, his voice breaking as he yelled, "I'm the CEO of Shirovia." "I haven't done anything." Then came the silence. That haunting silence from the passengers, eyes averted, fingers idle, no one moving. Another video showed him with the Rolex in his lap, working the blade free beneath the blanket. Then, the moment he stood, tape falling in strips to the floor, his arm twisted behind Darryl's back. The crowd gasped. A single hand clapped, then stopped. The hashtag at the bottom corner read, #, taped CEO. Kenton didn't speak. He didn't need to. Outside the room, journalists had gathered in the lobby. Some held microphones, others held phones, broadcasting live. The air was electric with outrage, curiosity, and, in some corners, disbelief. Shirovia's legal team arrived quickly. All male, all sharp suits and sharpened eyes. The lead counsel, Raymond Shaw, walked in without waiting for permission, placing a thick folder on the table before Kenton. "We're drafting now," he said without preamble. "Civil action against Ardent Air. Federal inquiry into crew conduct. We're also speaking with the FAA about license suspension hearings for everyone involved." Kenton nodded slowly, but his eyes remained fixed on the glass wall. Reeve was still seated, now speaking in hushed tones to the investigators. He looked exhausted, but not defeated. Raymond lowered his voice. "Do you want this to go public now?" Kenton finally turned his gaze. "It already is." He stood and moved to the window again. Beyond it, he saw a blur of passengers. Some he recognized from the flight, speaking to press, showing phone footage, pointing fingers in every direction. It was chaos, but it was the kind of chaos that often led to change. A soft knock on the door signaled another officer. "We've just detained Daryl Knox. He's been uncooperative. Blames everything on you." Kenton gave a dry smile. "Of course he does." The officer hesitated. "There's something else. We've noticed a pattern. Other passengers who received aggressive or suspicious treatment from Daryl during the flight, they all shared certain traits. Men of color, young, dressed well, first-class seats." Raymond straightened. "Are you suggesting profiling?" The officer shrugged, uneasy. "We're not ruling it out." Kenton nodded slowly. His thoughts drifted to the man at the gate before boarding. The odd questions about his destination, the overly long check-in delay. It hadn't made sense then, but now it settled in his chest like a stone. "This wasn't random," Kenton murmured. "It was calculated." He looked down at the Rolex on his wrist. The casing was scratched. The band was dented, but it still ticked, steady as ever. The gift from his grandfather had saved him in more ways than one. Still, he couldn't shake the thought that wouldn't leave him alone. What if he hadn't had it? What if there had been no camera, no watch, no Reeve? What if he had simply vanished into that silence? Outside, the noise was swelling. Screens in the terminal played muted footage of the incident. Headlines scrolled fast and sharp. Black CEO restrained mid-flight without cause. Airline under fire for in-flight discrimination. And beneath it all, that same tag. Number sign, taped CEO. Reeve exited the interview room, walking slowly toward Kenton, face pale but resolute. He didn't speak right away, just offered a small nod. Kenton returned it, understanding the weight behind it. The system had failed him. The people had watched. But now, for the first time, the silence was cracking. Kenton stared at the blank wall in front of him. No art, no color, just the sterile, empty white of bureaucracy. It reminded him of the many others, black men, brown men, young men, who weren't CEOs, who had no hidden blade, who weren't trending, who never made it past the walls. His hands clenched at his sides. "If I stay quiet, I become part of the silence that built this." 2 days after the incident, the cameras were already rolling when Kenton Durrell stepped up to the podium at Carovia Dynamics headquarters. No preamble, no music, no corporate branding banners, just the stark reality of what had happened and what was now unfolding. His right wrist bore a fresh bandage, clean but clearly still tender beneath. His suit was tailored, as always, but even in its sharpness, it couldn't mask the exhaustion behind his eyes. The press conference was packed wall-to-wall with reporters, legal analysts, corporate staff, and a select group of high-ranking Serovia executives, each one standing firmly behind him in silent unity. But it was the man to Kenton's left who drew the most surprise. Reeve. Dressed in a simple button-down shirt and slacks, the former flight attendant stood upright, his jaw tight, his eyes low but determined. The murmurs in the room swelled the moment cameras caught him, and Kenton didn't wait long before addressing why he was there. "I was restrained mid-flight," Kenton said, his voice measured, the room immediately falling silent. "Not for violence, not for crime, but for existing in a seat I was never supposed to occupy in their minds." There was a pause, intentional and long enough for the weight of the words to land. Flashbulbs popped. Several reporters scribbled frantically into notepads while others simply looked on, stunned. Kenton continued, "Ardent Air tried to contain the incident. They failed." At the back of the room, one of the Carovia comms directors subtly nodded. This was the moment they'd rehearsed, but even they couldn't have anticipated the chill in the air as Kenton spoke those words. It wasn't just a statement, it was a verdict. He stepped aside slightly, letting the room take in the screen behind him as it lit up with a logo. Sky Truth, a new independent watchdog organization dedicated to monitoring discrimination and inequity in air travel. "Today, I am announcing a joint initiative between Carovia Dynamics and Sky Truth," he said. "This is a personal investment, backed by my own family trust, not as a PR gesture, but as a long overdue reckoning." Some murmured, others nodded solemnly. The reporters leaned forward as Kenton gestured toward Reeve. "This man here," he said, "resigned from Ardent Air this morning. He was part of that flight crew, and he made a choice that few in his position ever do." He stepped forward. Reeve stepped up slowly to the microphone. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice, once he began, was steady. "I witnessed things on Flight 908 I can no longer ignore," Reeve said. "There was a pattern, one I now realize went far beyond that single flight. There were internal lists, verbal instructions to keep a closer eye on certain passengers, but it was always the same profile, and I kept my head down for too long." He stopped briefly, collecting himself as cameras zoomed in. "I was told that silence meant job security, but silence also meant complicity." The words struck hard, and while Reeve stepped back, Kenton returned to the mic. "We are opening whistleblower channels across every major airline that will cooperate. Reeve will oversee these efforts under Sky Truth. No employee, regardless of position, should have to choose between conscience and a paycheck." But just as the atmosphere began to shift, hope replacing tension, an unexpected development gripped the room. A reporter in the third row stood abruptly, holding a tablet aloft. "Mr. Durrell," he said, voice urgent but respectful, "we've just received an anonymous statement from a former Ardent Air pilot. It's verified. He claims that your incident wasn't a one-off. There's an internal algorithm, a profiling system." Kenton's eyes narrowed. The tension returned instantly. "What kind of system?" he asked quietly. "Something about categorizing passengers based on predictive discomfort indicators. The pilot says it was created to identify problematic profiles, those who statistically triggered more unease among staff. The words used were vague, but damning, and according to him, it disproportionately flagged black and brown travelers in first class." The room collectively inhaled. Kenton remained still, lips pressed tight. Around him, the legal team exchanged glances. They knew what this meant. This wasn't about one racist crew member anymore. It was a corporate directive. The reporter added, "The pilot asked to remain anonymous but said he's willing to speak with your lawyers directly. He said, and I quote, 'This wasn't a rogue crew. It was a broken system with a smiling face.'" "Begin with the algorithm," Kenton said firmly, his voice low but steady, as he sat at the head of the long mahogany conference table inside a private room at the Office for Aviation Oversight. His legal team had assembled, files spread before them like evidence at a courtroom drama, every page a piece of a puzzle that, once complete, would expose something far more sinister than a single act of discrimination. This wasn't just about duct tape anymore. It was about the machinery behind it, the silent engine powering injustice under the guise of security. Across from Kenton sat 3 government regulators, 2 younger investigators in Navy suits and an older man with salt and pepper hair, his nameplate reading Wesley Thorne. The room was sterile, walls bare save for a mounted screen that now displayed a series of internal Ardent Air documents, each time-stamped, confidential, and damning. Beside Kenton, his lead attorney, Roland Miles, tapped a page with a thick finger. "This system," he said, classified Mr. Durrell as a Tier 2 heightened attention risk before he ever stepped onto Flight 908. Wesley frowned, adjusting his glasses. "Based on what criteria?" "5 markers," Roland answered, 3 of which Kenton unknowingly triggered. Age bracket, 40 to 50. Nationality, dual citizenship flagged during booking, and the tone of voice recorded during check-in flagged as tense. He paused for effect, then added, "All determined by a proprietary AI system." Kenton leaned forward, folding his hands, his posture composed but his eyes sharp. "A system that reads our accents, judges our tone, and decides who makes other passengers uncomfortable. That's not security. That's discrimination, coded in silence." Thorne remained quiet for a beat, then glanced toward one of his aides who projected an internal Ardent email onto the screen. The subject line read, "Passenger flagging, premium zones." A paragraph stood out. "Certain appearances may create discomfort in our premium clients. Suggest refining filters accordingly." The room fell into silence. "This isn't about safety," Kenton said, rising slowly to his feet. "It's about appearance, about who they believe belongs up front and who they don't." Outside the building, protesters were beginning to gather, their chants distant but growing louder through the glass. Reporters with long-lens cameras hovered near the entrance, waiting for sound bites. The story had already begun to swell beyond anyone's control. Civil rights lawyers across the country were drafting motions. Tech experts were publishing op-eds. Ardent Air's name was being dragged across every major platform. Inside, the pressure mounted. Another investigator, a younger man with short, dark hair named Gideon, shifted in his seat and spoke. What's the connection between this system and what happened on the plane? Couldn't it still be an overzealous crew member acting on bias, not an algorithm? Roland opened a folder and slid it across the table. Inside were screenshots from another whistleblower, an ardent IT contractor. One image showed a flight crew tablet interface. A red triangle blinked beside Kenton's name with the words, Elevated Alert, Discreetly Monitor, Report Non-Compliance. Kenton's jaw clenched. They were following protocol. I was restrained not in spite of policy, but because of it. Thorne finally spoke again, slowly this time. This goes beyond civil liability. If these systems are used across other carriers, this could trigger federal oversight, industry-wide changes. That's the goal, Kenton replied, voice steady. This isn't just about me anymore. The meeting continued for another hour, building layer upon layer of evidence. Another email discussed how crew members should avoid direct confrontation, but remain firm when a passenger does not visually align with risk expectations. The language was always polite, always indirect, but the meaning was unmistakable. Outside, the protests had now swelled. Signs reading "Duct Tape Justice" and "Bias in the Skies" waved among the crowd. The internet had already branded the scandal hashtag Algorithm Air. Every hour, another high-profile voice joined the outcry. Ardent's stocks had dropped 6% overnight. Board members were in emergency sessions. And yet Kenton remained unmoved by the noise. His focus was locked on the system itself, the silent gatekeeper deciding who was worthy of trust at 30,000 feet. At one point, his phone vibrated with a news alert. Former Ardent Air pilot confirms algorithm used to profile problematic passengers based on race, age, and tone. The headline chilled him, not because it surprised him, but because it validated what he had feared since the moment Darrell whispered, "He looks dangerous." He handed the phone to Roland without a word. Later that evening, Kenton sat for an interview with a major news outlet. Cameras rolled, lights beamed down. The room was warm, but his voice was cool and precise. The duct tape, he said, pausing as the reporter leaned forward, was visible. But the real restraint was invisible, written in ones and zeros. Back at home, Kenton finally closed the front door behind him and leaned against it for a long moment. Eyes shut, breath slow. The silence inside his house was a relief and a burden. The media noise, the lawyers, the camera flashes, all gone for now. But the echo of duct tape ripping still lived somewhere inside him. His wrists, though healing, still bore faint red marks that pulsed every time he moved his hands. He walked into the living room, placed his damaged Rolex gently on the coffee table, and sank into the leather armchair without a word. 10 minutes passed before the knock came. He didn't need to ask who it was. Marcus Durrell, his father, stepped in carrying 2 paper bags of food, his back slightly hunched but his presence steady. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked at his son, took in the way his suit hung loose now, the bandage on his wrist, the tired fire in his eyes. He set the food down, nodded at the table where the Rolex sat, and said softly, "You always said that watch would open doors." Kenton looked at it, his jaw clenched, then exhaled. "Turns out it cuts through more than metal," Marcus added, easing himself into the seat across from him. There was a long pause. The room was dim, lit only by the slanted sunlight creeping through the blinds. Dust particles danced in the quiet. Kenton finally spoke, voice low and even. "I'm not done, Dad." Marcus gave a slight smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I didn't think you were." In the days that followed, Kenton refused to rest. Every morning he woke early and reviewed the messages flooding his inbox, some offering support, others sharing stories that mirrored his own. Former passengers, black pilots who were passed over for promotions, flight attendants written up for intervening in situations that never made headlines. Kenton took notes. He created folders. He didn't want sympathy, he wanted patterns, evidence, a foundation. He scheduled a series of quiet meetings, first with the Brotherhood of Black Aviators, who met him in a private conference room just outside Belcroft. The room buzzed with subdued energy, a mix of exhaustion and resolve. Older pilots leaned in close when Kenton spoke, nodding slowly. One of them, a graying man named Richard Hall, shared how he had been forced to step down after a minor disagreement with a co-pilot who later admitted to bias. "They said I was too aggressive," he said, his voice cracking. "I was asking for backup." Next, Kenton met with a group of former flight attendants, each one male, each one with a folder or flash drive full of warnings they had issued to airline leadership. One man named Saul had compiled over 60 written complaints about racial profiling incidents over a decade, and not a single one had been escalated. Another, Jamal, said quietly, "We're trained to de-escalate, but only some passengers are treated like threats before they even sit down." Kenton took it all in. The stories weighed on him, but they also lit something new beneath the surface, something colder, sharper. This wasn't just about Ardent Air anymore. It wasn't even about what happened on Flight 908. It was about an entire structure that operated on silent permission, one that used data, policies, and passivity to paint suspicion onto certain passengers while offering cover to others. On his office whiteboard, Kenton wrote the phrase, "Routine isn't safety if it's built on fear." He circled it, then underlined it. His next move was bold. He called in his executive team at Serovia, all of whom were men he trusted. A few were skeptical when he laid out his plan to create an independent, industry-wide transparency board that would push for policy changes in airline bias reporting, crew accountability, and AI oversight. But by the end of the meeting, their skepticism had turned into strategy. They started making calls. Meanwhile, the emotional weight of it all continued to surface in quiet moments. At night, Kenton found himself waking from shallow dreams, sitting bolt upright, his arm instinctively reaching for something that wasn't binding him anymore. The flashbacks weren't cinematic. They were slow, suffocating memories of silence, the kind that presses on your chest when no one speaks for you. One night, while scrolling through reports, he paused at a video from an old panel discussion. It was a clip of a younger version of himself speaking passionately about data ethics. "We have to stop designing systems that fail the people they claim to serve," he had said. He watched that version of himself with a strange detachment, pride, and sadness in equal measure. The real turn came when he received an encrypted email. The sender was anonymous, but the message was clear. A scanned document from a security contractor tied to multiple airlines. It included a list of passenger profile flags, with handwritten notes detailing appearance-based codes used during check-in. At the bottom, a red pen circled 5 initials, KD, next to a phrase, "Monitor closely," possibly disruptive. Kenton stared at it for a long time. That night, he met his father again on the back porch. Marcus was sipping black coffee, staring at the stars. Kenton sat beside him, the paper still in his hand. "I think they flagged me before I even boarded," he said. Marcus didn't respond right away. He just reached over and laid a hand on Kenton's shoulder. "Then it means they were afraid of the wrong thing." Kenton nodded. The night air was still. The trees barely moved. Somewhere in the distance, a train rumbled as if carrying away the last of his hesitation. He rose from the bench gripping the paper, then looked at the Rolex on his wrist, scarred but running. "My goal isn't just justice, it's prevention." The chair creaked beneath Kenton Durrell as he leaned forward, gripping the edge of the polished mahogany table with steady hands. Cameras clicked softly around him. The Congressional hearing room, with its towering ceilings and looming portraits of past legislators, felt colder than he expected. Bright lights bore down from above. Every breath, every twitch, every blink was being watched. Yet Kenton sat composed, shoulders squared, voice measured, gaze unwavering. He wasn't here as a tech executive, not today. He was here as a man who had once been duct-taped to his seat like a criminal for no reason other than existing in the wrong body, in the wrong seat, on the wrong airline. A senator from the Oversight Committee adjusted his microphone. "Mr. Durrell, the floor is yours." Kenton nodded once and stood. The hush that fell over the chamber was immediate and absolute. "When I boarded Ardent Air Flight 908, he began, voice clear, I was headed to deliver a keynote speech on ethical innovation. I never made it to that stage. Instead, I became a lesson in what happens when bias hides behind a uniform and a smile." His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. The weight of each word landed like a gavel. "I wasn't asked to move. I wasn't questioned. I was restrained, taped, silenced. Not because I was a threat, but because someone decided I looked like one. And dozens watched." He paused, scanning the room. Eyes met his and quickly looked away. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats, uncomfortable under the truth. I was bound to a seat not just with tape, but with the quiet compliance of people who knew it was wrong and said nothing. I was not just restrained, I was erased. A murmur rippled through the audience, quickly stifled by the gavel of the chairman. Kenton inhaled slowly and continued. The footage you've all seen, the images, the hashtags, the headlines, they tell part of the story. But they don't show the moment I looked into the eyes of a flight attendant and saw nothing. No regret, no doubt, just certainty. That's what shook me most. Another pause, a deep one. And then, "People say I'm lucky I had a Rolex," Kenton said, lifting his left wrist slightly, the timepiece visible beneath his cuff. No, I was unlucky to need it in the first place. The silence that followed was almost reverent. Even the stenographers seemed to hesitate. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the flicker of pain beneath Kenton's calm exterior. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. He sat back down, fingers laced together, and waited. Over the next hour, the Ardent Air executives squirmed in their seats as lawmakers fired questions. One tried to minimize the incident, suggesting isolated misconduct by an overzealous crew. But when pressed on internal protocols and AI-based passenger flagging, the executive stuttered. Documents recently submitted into evidence showed the existence of a profiling algorithm that flagged passengers based on arbitrary markers, none of which Kenton had known about before that day. Race, check-in tone, seating class. It was all there. Senator Halson, a stern-faced man with steel-gray hair, turned to the committee. "We are not discussing human error. We are discussing systemized negligence. Let that be clear." By midday, the Transportation Oversight Commission announced it would be introducing new federal regulations. One by one, the new mandates were laid out: full transparency on all AI-based passenger monitoring systems, third-party audits every 6 months, and, most crucially, whistleblower protection for flight staff who came forward with abuse claims. Outside the building, protesters held up signs with Kenton's image and the words, "duct-taped but not silenced." Across social media, the phrase trended alongside growing calls for industry-wide reform. But inside the room, Kenton remained focused. The storm outside didn't distract him. The headlines didn't swell his pride. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing something harder to win: accountability. Later that day, in a quiet interview room just off Capitol Hill, a young reporter sat across from Kenton, voice hesitant. "Mr. Durrell, how does it feel to become a symbol of this movement?" Kenton leaned forward, his expression softening, but his voice firm. "I'm not a symbol," he said. "I'm a reminder, because this never should have happened at all." The press cameras clicked in rapid succession as Kenton Durrell stepped onto the marble platform at the edge of Carovia's newly renovated downtown headquarters. The storm had quieted, but its aftershocks still pulsed through the media, boardrooms, and federal agencies. Ardent Air had settled the lawsuit quietly, trying to keep the dollar figure under wraps. But sources close to the legal teams confirmed what everyone suspected. The settlement had crossed the $20 million mark. Kenton had never wanted the money. He stood behind the podium, a dark navy suit draped over his shoulders, one hand resting on the polished wood, the other holding a small note card he barely looked at. Behind him, the Carovia board had gathered, not out of formality, but solidarity. To his right stood Reeve Porter, no longer a hesitant flight attendant but the newly appointed director of SkyTruth's Enforcement Division, eyes steady, posture strong. A year ago, Reeve would have avoided this spotlight. Now, he met it head-on. "Let's be clear," Kenton began, voice firm, unshaken. "This wasn't just about me. It was about a system, one that quietly decided who was a threat based on nothing but skin, tone, and presence." He paused, letting the silence settle. Cameras zoomed in. "Ardent Air disbanded the profiling algorithm," he continued. 3 executives were removed. Independent audits will now oversee their operations for the next 5 years. His tone remained composed, but beneath the surface, a quiet storm brewed in his chest, rage channeled into resolve. "But those are not my victories. They're only corrections to a mistake that should have never happened." Reeves stepped forward for his portion of the address, gripping the edges of the podium. His voice wasn't as polished, but it carried something more valuable: honesty. "We've launched a digital dashboard through SkyTruth. It lets passengers report mistreatment anonymously, in real time. He held up a sleek black device, tapping the interface. Already we've received dozens of credible reports. Some sound like mine. Others sound like his. He gestured to Kenton. And many sound like no one's ever listened before. The audience, filled with reporters, civil rights advocates, and tech entrepreneurs, murmured as the screen behind them displayed blurred passenger submissions, snippets of audio, videos of altercations, complaint summaries. The reality was undeniable. The abuse had never been isolated. It had been normalized. After the conference, inside a private boardroom framed by tinted glass and soft halogen lights, Carovia's board gathered for an unscheduled vote. Kenton sat quietly, unsure what the room's mood meant. Most of the board had remained neutral during the height of the controversy, not unsupportive, but cautious. George Salen, the CFO, cleared his throat and looked around the room. Traditionally, this moment would come with a bonus, a financial gesture to reward you for what we now recognize was a globally visible act of integrity. Kenton raised an eyebrow. Traditionally. George smiled faintly. But we think it's time to build new traditions. The screen behind him flickered on, revealing a document titled Carovia Equity Flight Initiative. Below it, a formal pledge of $50 million over the next decade to support travel equity, advocacy, and real-time justice technologies, partnered with Sky Truth. "This will be our legacy," said George, voice thickening just slightly. "Not what happened to you, but what you did with it." Kenton swallowed hard but kept his face composed. Emotion would come later, in private. For now, there was only the mission. As he stepped out onto the rooftop garden for air, a breeze swept across the city skyline. The sounds of traffic below were muffled, distant. He looked at the scratch along his Rolex, the one mark he hadn't fixed. His fingers traced it absently. Reeve joined him moments later, hands in his jacket pockets. "You think it'll hold?" he asked. "The system?" "The change," Reeve clarified. Kenton didn't answer right away. Instead, he watched a plane cut through the clouds overhead, white trail slicing the sky like a wound trying to heal. "We've exposed the rot," he said finally. "Now we keep showing people what the wound looks like, over and over, until someone does more than just cover it." Inside, the Sky Truth dashboard pinged again, another report submitted. A father, a dark-skinned child, a business class seat. Back in the press room, a young intern clicked the video link and watched, eyes widening as a new face recounted a familiar story. A movement had started, and it wasn't slowing down. Later that week, Carovia's internal memo formally announced Kenton's initiative as a core arm of the company's mission, a tribute not in words, but in action. One line echoed through the email thread, from boardroom to break room. "The skies aren't friendly until they're fair." Kenton Durrell stepped onto the jet bridge without hesitation. The air inside the aircraft felt cooler than expected, touched by a quiet hum of soft music and the sterile scent of recycled air. There were no flashing cameras, no reporters, no press handlers. Just the calm stillness of a boarding routine, row by row, zone by zone. A far cry from the whirlwind of the past year. The boarding agent had greeted him by name at the gate, not with the strained smile of someone trained to feign courtesy, but with the careful warmth of someone who knew exactly who he was. "Welcome back, Mr. Durrell," the man had said, voice steady, eyes not avoiding his like so many others once did. Now, as Kenton walked toward his seat in first class, every step down the narrow aisle echoed with the ghosts of that terrible day on Flight 908. The same cabin configuration, the same seat number, 2A. He ran his fingers lightly along the headrest before sitting, almost as if confirming that nothing had changed. And yet, everything had. He slid into the seat with calm precision, straightening his charcoal blazer and resting his briefcase gently at his feet. His eyes moved slowly to the window beside him. The clouds outside were thick and gray, like a curtain holding back something unseen. His reflection looked back at him in the glass, older, perhaps, more grounded, a man who had once been taped down and silenced, now seated upright with quiet authority. No duct tape, no fear, just awareness. He wore the same Rolex, scratched, repaired, and deliberately polished. It caught the cabin light like a relic. This timepiece had not only cut through tape, it had cut through ignorance, systems, and silence. A voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me, sir." Kenton turned. Standing beside him was a young black flight attendant, clean-shaven, nervous but steady. His name tag read Terrence. His hands were clasped in front of him, and his eyes betrayed a mixture of admiration and vulnerability. "I just wanted to say—" Terrence leaned in slightly, voice low, heart clearly pounding. "Thank you, sir. You changed everything." Kenton looked at him, not with surprise but with understanding, the kind that only comes from weathering the same storms. He gave a small nod, his voice soft but full. "Keep going," he said simply. Terrence smiled, just barely, and returned to the galley, his posture a little taller. The plane began to taxi. Outside, rain tapped gently against the fuselage, each drop a memory, each vibration a reminder. Kenton closed his eyes briefly, letting the sound settle inside him. Around him, the cabin moved in subtle rhythms. Seat belts clicked, engines rumbled, tray tables shifted. But, unlike the last time, there was no distrust lurking in the corners, no eyes burning holes in his back, no crew member whispering into a comm line, just people and change. As the aircraft rose into the sky, Kenton stared down at the Rolex. His thumb brushed the tiny ridge where the hidden blade once flicked open. It had been retracted for good, the mechanism sealed. He didn't need it anymore. The plane pierced the cloud cover and golden light spilled into the cabin like a quiet promise. For a moment, everything was still. Kenton smiled softly. He looked ahead at the aisle. Once a gauntlet of prejudice, now a path lined with possibility. Each footstep of the crew, each rustle of a passenger's newspaper felt like a silent agreement that things would never go back to the way they were. Not entirely. Not while people like Terrence walked these aisles. Not while the truth had already taken flight. "I wasn't supposed to survive that flight, but now, I fly for everyone who couldn't." They tried to bind him, but his power broke free. If you believe in overcoming oppression with dignity, subscribe now. Together, we stand tall. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights themes of racial profiling, injustice, and the fight for dignity under pressure. Its purpose is to provoke thought and inspire empathy around systemic bias and resilience.